dreadful noise plebs make when they're happy.
Hello there, everyone. I hope you're doing well. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the second secession of the plebeians that happened in 449 BC. In my other video, on the first secession, which took place in the year 494 BC, we saw that end with the creation of the tribune of the plebs. And at the end of this one, Rome will have its first written legal code, which is a big move, a big moment for any civilization. But before that, we got to see how what we know as the 12 tables came to be. So back in the year 494, at the end of the first secession, the plebeians were given the right to elect the plebeian tribunes, as well as hold the plebeian council. This council was the main legislative and judicial assembly for the plebeian population of Rome. The top plebeian men would convene and discuss issues that were important to them and, go over the struggles faced by the poor population of Rome, and supposedly, be there looking out for the people. Well, over the 40-ish years since the patricians had conceded and given in to the plebeian demands in 494, the lots in life of many of the plebeian class citizens, they had improved, but definitely not as much as they had hoped and wished for when they revolted decades ago. Of course, the patricians, they still had a stranglehold on the wealth of the state and held all the most powerful political positions, like the consulship, as well as the plebeians still being subject to the whims and wishes of whatever the patricians deemed lawful. Like in the times of the first secession, it was not uncommon to see a Roman patrician abusing a plebeian for something as little as a perceived slight on the patrician man's honor. With the invention of the plebeian council and the tribune of the plebs, at this point Rome was kind of like two states inside of one, especially because whatever the plebeian council decreed, well, the patricians, they didn't have to listen to that. And if the people's tribunes, they didn't like something that the patricians and the Senate were trying to do, they could just use their veto, and that'd be the end of that. So really, it's just two groups of people with very different wants that all just fall under the Roman banner for now, but it wouldn't take much for this whole thing to fall apart into a civil war. Because there is wealthy plebeians who would have much rather probably preferred to be the leaders of their own little city, city-state, where they could be the special families who got to make all the rules and boss everybody around. But somehow, the patricians and plebeians were able to work together mostly. Of course, not without any resistance, but in the end, they did make things work. Which I think we can all agree is a testament to the Romans and their way of somehow keeping this thing that they call the Republic alive for so long. I remember reading or hearing somewhere that it's not the fact that the Republic fell, it's the fact that they were even able to have one without it falling into constant civil wars until finally, one guy ends up on top. Well, at least they didn't let that happen for a few centuries, but, you get the point. Let me get back on track here. The Romans had gotten rid of their monarchy and replaced the king with two consuls. Now, the Roman people, they had come up with a time limit for the consuls. 1 year in office was the term, and then after that you had to wait another 10 years to run again for consul. They did it this way because the Romans were very wary of one man gaining too much power and becoming, or trying to become, king of Rome. So they made it so that the highest position in their new form of government was only held for 1 year, and that there was 2 of these positions every year. And that gave them the peace of mind that never again will a king rule over them. What they didn't do, though, is actually define what powers the 2 consuls actually held. Could a consul go and murder a Roman citizen and not be charged or held responsible for it because of the rank he held? Well, nobody really knew what the limits of a consul's power really were at the time. So it was in the year 462 BC, 8 years before the time of our story, that a man named Gaius Terentilius Harsa, who was a tribune of the plebs, proposed the Lex Terentilia, which was a bill that proposed that a 5-man commission should be set up, and that those 5 men should come together to determine the limits of consular power and define what the laws of Rome actually were. But for 8 years, the patricians just kept stalling and stalling on the debate of this bill until finally the plebeians, realizing it would just be pointless to continue to try and get the patricians to agree to this bill, they just said, look, you know what, we get it. You're never going to budge on the Lex Terentilia bill, but will you patricians at least consent to the appointment of a body of legislators chosen in equal numbers from plebeians and patricians to enact what would be useful to both orders and secure equal liberty for each? Well, surprisingly, the patricians agreed, except they said they would only allow it if only patricians were allowed to be the legislators. And though the plebeians, they did try to fight back against this stipulation, in the end, they caved because they were just hoping to get something. I mean, really, it's obvious now to see the only reason why the patricians agreed to this was because they were going to be the ones in charge of it, and they could use it to control to keep the status quo, And the plebeians, well, their mistake was trusting that the patricians were going to do anything in good faith. But again, they could only do so much, and sometimes you have to take whatever victories you can get. So after 8 years of back and forth, finally, the envoys, they were made ready, and they were going to travel to Athens and learn the laws of Solon. Now, many historians doubt that this actually happened. Athens was a long way away from Rome back then, and there's nothing to really corroborate the story. But really, whether they went to Athens or not, it wouldn't really matter too much because there was definitely Greek peoples much closer than that they could have just talked to and asked about how the Greeks, how they did law. And by the year 452, the Romans, they were ready to start compiling their own code of laws. They just had to figure out how to do so. The idea they came up with in my head was not a good one. They decided to create the decemviri consulari imperio legibus scribundis, the decemvirs with consular powers for writing laws. Now, what you might be thinking like, okay, great, the Romans, they're making progress here. They're going to get together, they're going to make some laws, everyone is happy and cool with it. It'll be great. Well, not really, because each of the 10 decemvirs was a patrician. Somehow, those weaselly bastards convinced the plebeian leadership that all 10 decemvirs should be patricians, and that if you let that be, if you let us just do this, then we promise not to repeal any of the laws that were made in the plebeian councils, we'll be sure to leave what you've done for yourselves alone. Just, trust us. Now this right here, this makes me believe that whoever was the plebeian leadership at this time, they weren't actually in it for the people, and they were just using their positions to gain their own wealth instead of looking out for the people they were supposed to. Kind of like nowadays, we've got two groups of people telling us, here, pick us, we'll help you, we're the good guys. But in the end, both sides are working for the same people and are just in it for the money. The first decemvirate was made up of these 10 men here. And the story goes that these 10 men were actually quite good at their job, and it wasn't long before they had drafted 10 tables, brought them to the people, so that they could see them, discuss them, and then go over them to see if they wanted to make any changes. And when everyone was happy, they published these 10 tables, and the decemvirate themselves, they were disbanded. Except the people, they weren't fully satisfied, and there was a general feeling amongst the population that some things hadn't been addressed, and that there needed to be more tables to the law. So, without really thinking anything of it, the people called for another decemvirate to be made, and that they should come together until they finished the law completely. So an election was held, and the second group of decemvirs, they were chosen. However, this new group, they didn't really follow the lead of the first group. Right from the start, instead of them rotating the lictors from man to man, to the man who was in charge, Each of them gathered 12 lictors around themselves. They also made it quite clear that there would be no appealing any rulings or judgments made by them, and that if anybody tried to say something to them about their abuse of power, well, it didn't really end well for them. Over their time in power, it only got worse for the plebeians. More and more, they were being dealt with cruelty. The Senate and patricians, for as much as they despised the decemvirs as well, they didn't really help out. In their minds, the plebeians, they were the main reason why these men were in control of the state in the first place, and that their current conditions was only the fault of their own for trying to change the government that they were living under before. Basically like, ha, you idiots, you thought you had it so bad under us patricians before, well, look at how much worse it can get. Possibly hoping that the plebeian struggles would make them wish that they had the patricians back in charge. I forgot to mention as well, when the decemvirs took power, all the other tribunes and other positions in the government were suspended, as well as the right to appeal to a tribune or to one of the assemblies. The goal with this was to try and help the decemvirs move things along faster, but in the end, it screwed the plebeians over to not have anybody, not have any protection against the decemvirs at all, and even the patricians had no protection against them. Now, surprisingly, the decemvirs, they actually did come up with 2 new tables and presented them to the people, again. But when their terms were supposed to be done and new elections held for the various open positions in government, the men didn't allow for any elections to be held. They also claimed that since they never actually held a vote on whether to ratify these 2 new tables of law, that their terms of office, they weren't actually over, since they were elected to finish the 12 tables and then vote on them. But since they never voted, they shouldn't have to step down. It was at this time, just like in the first secession of the plebs, that an outside force moves things forward. A Sabine army had been spotted in Roman territory, so the decemvirs are said to have called a Senate meeting. But none of the senators showed up, because at this point, even they were like, yeah, fuck you guys. The decemvirate, you guys are ass. To the plebeians, now this was a clear sign that these men, they were illegitimately and legally holding the city under control. They all knew these men should just be normal private citizens again. The plebeians also, they were thinking about boycotting the military levy that the decemvirs were trying to hold, but eventually the decemvirs called the Senate together again, and this time some of them actually showed up, to the dismay of the plebeians. They actually saw that as a betrayal of their liberty. But the senators that did show up, they actually came to denounce the decemvirs, and they started calling them normal citizens and saying that no levy will be held due to you men not holding any legal authority. But in the end, the senators relented because they feared that a plebeian revolt and an attack on the city by the Sabines at the same time would, basically be the end of Rome, and the plebeians were scared of violent reprisals for refusing military service, so they also reluctantly joined. It's here where the story of Lucius Siccius is told. A former tribune of the plebs, Siccius was a Roman war hero. Earlier in his career, when he was sent on what seemed to be a suicide mission to go and attack the camp of the Aquii, while the main force of the army was bogged down fighting. Well, in the end, Siccius, he didn't die, and actually, he managed to capture the camp and sent the defending Aquii running off into the fields, which in turn panicked the rest of their army, and they were routed. Well, Siccius, he was fighting in one of the 2 armies that had been made to battle against the Sabines, and it was during this time that he began to advocate for secession, and that the tribunes of the plebs, they must be reinstalled. Well, it didn't take very long for his body to be found one morning. Clearly, he had been assassinated. And the news of his death, well, that just stoked further resentment that was already building up in the army. Back in the city of Rome, one of the decemvirs, they had not gone out with either of the armies to face the Sabines. Appius Claudius, who was a consul 20 years before, in the year 471, he was back in the city of Rome, apparently, specifically, because the other decemvirs believed his brutality would be well suited in putting down any popular uprisings, if any sprang up. Well, now Appius at this time, he's just a creepy old guy, and he's about to do some serious creepy old guy shit. You see, Appius had a little crush on a much younger woman whose name was Verginia. Verginia was the daughter of a centurion by the name of Lucius Verginius, and also the fiancée of a former tribune of the plebs, Lucius Achilles. Initially, Appius, he did try to woo her the good old-fashioned way, I guess you could say. He was buying her things and promising her, everything she could ever want. But Verginia, she had no interest in him, and she denied his advances. Now Appius, of course, he just accepted her choice and let her be, and went on with his life like a respectable gentleman. Just kidding, he fucking kidnapped this lady, and he did it in the most ridiculous, in-your-face way. Appius came up with a plan that his friend, a one Marcus Claudius, he would approach Verginia in broad daylight, grab her in front of everybody, and then just start telling anybody around that this girl, she's actually one of my escaped slaves. Of course, Verginia protested, and so did her friends that were around her, but this was ancient times, so a man's word over a girl's was all that was really needed, and Verginia found herself being brought to the court so that the matter at hand could be dealt with. It just so happened to be that with all the other decemvirs out of the city, and no other assembly or tribune to appeal to, Verginia was brought in front of the only man who could be a judge at this time. And that was Appius Claudius. When the fake court session began, Marcus, Appius's friend and co-conspirator, he began to tell a story of how Verginia was actually the daughter of one of his slaves, and that she had secretly been taken from him and brought to the house of Verginius. Therefore, she was a slave, and that she, as a slave, belonged to him. Achilles, the fiancé of Verginia, and her friends pleaded with Appius, to, at the very least, postpone his judgment until her father could make it back to the city, and to please leave her in the custody of them until then. Reluctantly, Appius, he did actually agree to let them fetch the girl's father, but that was only after Achilles was forced to pay money as her guarantor. But he denied the request that she be given back into her family's custody until this was all over. And it was he, Appius, who Verginia would be staying with. In ancient Rome, a young girl was only ever supposed to sleep under her father's roof and also remain a virgin until she was married to her husband. Appius taking Verginia into his home was a very, very scandalous thing to the Romans, and this pissed off a lot of people. So much so that he actually backed off and allowed her to return home for the time being. Achilles sent his brother and a relative of Verginia to find the military camp that Lucius Verginius was staying in, and as soon as he heard what was happening, he raced back to the city. And 2 days later, on the morning that he arrived, he collected his daughter from his home, and then made his way through the city to Appius, while a large crowd was gathering behind him. When he arrived at the meeting place, Verginius began to plead with the people around him to help him and to save his daughter from dishonor, but before he was finished with his remarks, Appius, without any deliberation or any care at all, interrupted Verginius and condemned his daughter to slavery, upholding the false claims of Marcus Claudius. The crowd, which was stunned into silence, watched as Marcus made his way towards Verginia. But before he could reach her, Verginius pulled a knife from his tunic and stabbed his own daughter to death, exclaiming, "In this one way, the only one in my power, do I secure to you your liberty." Basically saying, the only way I can save you from being, our word, I can't say the word that, you know what I mean, abused and assaulted by this man, Appius, is to end your life and spare you that fate. Appius, he did order that Verginius be seized, but right after he had done the deed, he escaped easily through the crowd gathered around him. Now this was the straw that broke the camel's back. The people were absolutely incensed, and when Appius ordered his lictors to go after Verginius, not only did the gathered crowd of plebeians step in to stop them, but even 2 patrician men stepped up and told the lictors that if Appius was going to actually try and arrest and go after Verginius in a legal manner, then they themselves would protect him from the prosecution of a private citizen. And that if Appius wanted to try and make use of violence, that there too he would find them a match for him. The 2 names given for these men are Lucius Valerius Potitus and Marcus Horatius Barbatus. Thanks, guys, for rolling with the poor people. While Verginius was fleeing back to his camp, these 2 men, they made speeches to the people gathered there, and Appius Claudius, he actually fled the city. Another one of the decemvirs who was now back in Rome, he didn't know how to handle the situation, so he called the Senate together for a meeting. But the senators at this point, they were also done dealing with the decemvirs, and they offered no help at all. Actually, they were more concerned that when Verginius reached the military camp, that he would cause the soldiers there to revolt as well. So they tried to actually send messengers ahead of him to the decemvirs that were commanding the army, but they were too late, and when he arrived back at the camp, he riled up all the soldiers there, more than he actually riled up the citizens back in the city. These men, they were from the army that had been sent to go and fight the Aquii. After being sufficiently angered by the news brought to them by Verginius, they resolved to march back to Rome, and when they got there, they actually ascended the Aventine Hill and began to make camp there. The other army that had been sent to fight the Sabines, well, Achilles, the former fiancé of Verginia, he had also managed to get out of Rome, and he had made his way over to them, where he told them all about what happened back in Rome, and they too packed up their camps and marched back to Rome, where they joined their fellow soldiers on the Aventine Hill. Now, while they were encamped on the Aventine, the soldiers, they were trying to get the rest of the plebeians in the city to also secede, and some senators were trying to get the decemvirs to finally step down. But they refused to do so, saying that because the new laws, they haven't been ratified, that our terms, they still aren't done yet. Well, this only pissed off the soldiers more, and they decided that they were going to leave the city completely and go to the Mont Sacre, the sacred mountain, just like their forefathers had done during the first secession of the plebs, back in 494 BC. And while all this was happening, another former plebeian tribune named Marcus Duilius, he was making speeches to the people left in the city, trying to convey the importance of showing the patricians that, you know what, we're a strong, united front here, and we're sticking with our soldiers there, and we really want to show you what kind of danger you could be in if you don't come to the bargaining table with us. So with that, the people packed up their stuff, joined the soldiers, and deserted the city for the Sacred Mount as well. And now, finally, with the city abandoned and the war with the Sabines and the Aquii still going on, the patricians realized that they were in a losing position and that the decemvirs, they had to go. Will ye suffer all things to go to wreck and ruin? Do you mean to administer justice to walls and mere houses? What are ye to do in case the enemy should approach the city? Well, as you can see, it's not because they actually cared or saw the side and the struggles of the plebeians that they finally relented. No, 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 no. It was only because they realized that they would lose everything if they didn't capitulate to the demands of the plebeians. So the Senate forcibly disbanded the decemvirate, but they did give them immunity from being prosecuted for any of the crimes they may have committed during the 2 years that they were in charge. This was actually one of the things denied to the plebs in negotiations. They did want to prosecute some of the decemvirs for crimes, but they did concede immunity to them to get, more of what they really wanted. Lucius Valerius and Marcus Horatius, they made their way to the Sacred Mount on orders of the Senate to negotiate further with the plebeians, and after meeting with the plebeian leaders, the demands they received were that the tribune of the plebs must be reinstalled, as well as having the right to appeal to the assemblies, and on top of that, complete immunity as well for any of the people who could be seen as, the leaders or the ones who started the rebellion. This was all agreed to, and the people made their way back to Rome, where the newly installed plebeian council passed a bill to elect new consuls for the year 449 BC. The two men elected were Valerius and Horatius. These two men would go on to introduce what we call the Valerio-Horatian laws. These laws made it so that any resolutions that were reached by the plebeian council were not only binding on the plebeian citizenry, but on the patrician class as well, meaning that the plebeians could make laws that the patricians would now have to follow. The only catch in that is that the laws passed in the plebeian council would first have to be ratified by the Senate. But if they didn't like it, they could kind of just veto the law altogether. This is what will get Tiberius Gracchus in trouble in the future when he bypasses the Senate and brings his new reforms right to the people. But that is a story for another day. Another stipulation was that the Senatus Consulta, the decrees of the Senate, must be kept inside the Temple of Ceres, and that the plebeian aediles, they would be the ones to look after them. This would allow anyone to truly know what the decrees of the Senate were, and allow the plebeians to have knowledge about the laws they lived under, instead of it just being under the control of the patricians who could change or add and remove any laws as they saw fit for whatever situation they were in. Another portion of the laws these men made declared that no government position can be created without the allowal of an appeal. Basically meaning like, hey, you can't just come up with some random position and say it has control over a bunch of stuff without there being the option for the people to appeal to the assemblies and to the other magistrates about it. This law obviously was clearly made with the decemvirs in mind. They also restored the sacrosanctity of the tribunes and even extended it to the plebeian aediles as well. And of course, the ratification and publication of the 12 tables was the first thing the plebeians demanded. Livy, he does make a note that all of these laws that were passed, they were passed at the dismay of the patricians, and they begrudgingly went along with it because really they had no choice. It was either they did this or they wouldn't have a population to rule over anyways. So they didn't actively try and stop the plebeians from making these new laws, but they were definitely butthurt about it. Then before marching out of the city to go face the Sabines and Aquii, after all was said and done, the Romans made sure to engrave the laws of the 12 tables on bronze tablets that they placed right in the middle of the forum for all to see. And for everything the Romans did, this right here could possibly be their greatest legacy, producing a civil and legal system that over time has touched the lives of countless people, even up to this very day. All thanks to some poor plebeians who lived over 2,500 years ago. If you're wondering what happened to the decemvirs, especially Appius, well, the plebeians, of course, wanted his head on a stake, so they did actually ask Verginius, who had been made a tribune of the plebs after the Second Secession, if he would prosecute Appius for the crimes he had committed. Verginius, though, said no, he wouldn't do that, but that he would go after Appius in another way. Appius was arrested and brought to trial, where Verginius posed one question to him: can you prove, or bring someone to prove, that you didn't legally adjudge a free Roman citizen to the custody of another who claimed she was a slave? Of course, he's speaking of his daughter Verginia. Appius, he tried to fight back at Verginius, saying that he should be put on trial to determine if his new laws actually established peace or a tyranny. Verginius, though, he just kept asking if he could provide anyone to prove his innocence. When he couldn't, Verginius ended the trial. After being arrested, Appius Claudius found himself sitting alone in a jail cell, where he committed suicide. Another one of the decemvirs was also arrested, and he too decided to end things instead of face the music. His name was Spurius Appius Cornison. I don't know if I pronounced that last one right. But the wealth and property of both of these men, they were confiscated, while the other decemvirs were exiled from the city of Rome. And that is the end of the Second Secession. Though not the end of the struggles between the patricians and plebeians. I think I'm going to probably put the third, fourth, and fifth secessions all in one video, since they don't have too much meat to them. There's not really much information that I can find on them. Not like the first two. In fact, actually, there's a debate among historians if this so-called second decemvirate even happened, and that this whole story is just a tale made up to admonish the first decemvirate of men for making a shitty law that forbid plebeians and patricians to be married and led to the third secession. But either way, if it's true or not, it's a good story, and I hope you enjoyed listening. Have a good one.